It's been a hot minute since I reviewed a smartphone on the channel, but today we're looking at the Redmi Note 14 Pro 5G. Not to be confused, however, with the non-5G model, which offers different specifications. Now, it is worth pointing out over here that the Pro 5G is available with two different configurations, at least at the time of filming and in the UK. Here you have got a 256GB internal storage model with 8GB of RAM, and that can be found for £300, while you have also got a 512GB model with 12GB of RAM that can be found for £350. You certainly might want to consider the latter, purely because you have got no sort of expandable storage. Now, with that in mind, let's see if the smartphone is actually worth its price tag. So let's kick things off and talk about its design, and here I really do love what the manufacturers achieved. While the cameras don't exactly look all that special, the actual textures and feel of the phone itself actually feel pretty premium. Here you have got a vegan leather, which is available in a few different colors, and you've also got an aluminium composite frame, which gives you a little bit of extra rigidity and therefore a little bit more security if you're going to be dropping the phone accidentally. Now, the phone is available in midnight black, coral green, or the pictured lavender purple. And it also just weighs in at 190 grams, making it very easy to hold. Now, there is a fingerprint sensor that's found underneath the screen, and it actually does respond extremely well, although the positioning is a little further down for my liking. I wish it was just a little bit higher up from the bottom bezel, making it a little bit easier to press. Nonetheless, you've also got face unlock to make things speed up a little bit. Now, the phone has also got IP68 dust and water resistance, and therefore means that it's immersible up to 1.5 meter depth for 30 minutes. But in terms of design, one thing I don't like are the physical buttons. They're positioned on the right hand side of the smartphone, and you've got a volume rocker and a power button. Now, the buttons themselves are a little bit hard to press due to their pretty slender look, and also sometimes feel a little bit odd when you're actually actuating them. Therefore means that if you have got, let's say, woolly gloves on, it might be a little bit hard to utilize the smartphone on a day-to-day basis. Also, it is worth pointing out there is no 3.5mm jack like you'd find on some other rival alternatives, and therefore audio is routed directly via the USB Type-C port. Now, on that note, here you have got a stereo speaker configuration, and the external speakers are actually pretty good. When I was doing my test, I had no issues whatsoever. Furthermore, you've also got Dolby Atmos support, and this can be enabled via the sound effects tab that can be found within the phone settings. Here it does add a little bit of extra dynamism, and you've even got a multi-band EQ, which is a really nice touch by the manufacturer. Of course, if you do not want this sort of surround sound effect, you can disable it and go for the Xiaomi sound instead. So next up, let's talk about what you're going to be seeing on a day-to-day basis. And of course, over here I'm referring to the 6.67-inch 120Hz AMOLED display, which has a resolution of 1220 x 2712. It has also got Corning's Gorilla Glass Victus 2, which has got scratch resistance. And there's also a pre-applied screen protector on the phone, so therefore when you get it out of the box, you don't have to pre-apply anything. Now, the display itself is actually pretty nice. You've got curved edges on the side, which makes it a little bit easier to grip and use on a day-to-day basis, and it also has got a near bezel-less look, at least from the front. As for the colors, they really do pop, and you've got HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision, which can be useful if you are using something that is supported with it. Now, the display itself does get pretty bright, and I recorded up to 650 nits in auto mode, and it normally sits at roughly 400 to 450 nits, although this is quite below the manufacturer's claim. Nonetheless, over here, the smartphone does get pretty bright, and I had no issues when using it in a bright sunlit condition. It is also great to see that it gets all the way down to 1.87 nits, therefore meaning the screen can get very dim and won't be an issue to use if you're going to be using your smartphone in a very dark room, for example, when you have all the lights off. Speaking about the display, it's actually pretty good when it comes to multi-touch input. I had no problems when it came to doing my tests. And furthermore, it's actually pretty responsive when it comes to the overall touch input itself. Yes, indeed, over here, this might be of greatest importance when it comes to taking quick burst photos. Now, this does bring me on to the overall camera performance. And at the rear, you have got a 200 megapixel f1.65 wide lens, an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide, and then a 2 megapixel f2.4 macro. Now the macro lens, in my opinion, is a bit redundant. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose, and you'll not get great sort of quality shots from it. As for the ultra-wide, it gives you quite softened images. Of course, it's always useful to have an ultra-wide lens because you can capture a little bit more detail around you, but when it comes to the actual detail of the photo itself, well, it's not going to be all that impressive, specifically with that 8 megapixel count. However, the main 200 megapixel lens is actually fantastic, especially over here if you're using with noble lighting conditions. When it came to doing my test, I was actually left pretty impressed by what the manufacturer was able to achieve. The processing doesn't seem to be overly done, and in terms of the color tones, it seems to be pretty natural while giving you a little bit of extra pop in terms of your images, which I think a lot of people will actually quite like. Now in terms of the zoom level, it does go all the way up to 30 times, although I'll use this quite sparingly, because while you zoom in, you'll find there's quite a lot of noise. Hopefully these images will give you an indication of that, and therefore means that if you're just going to be taking photos, I'd opt for using from 1 to 2 times zoom at most. Now what isn't as impressive, however, is the low light photography capabilities of this smartphone. Now sure enough, there's some other phones out there at this price point that will also struggle, but I was just expecting a little bit more, specifically given the overall specs of the rear cameras. Here, you'll be hopefully able to see there's quite a lot of noise and some of the photos look a bit blurry. Now in this respect, it is nice to see that you have got the 200 megapixel mode and also a night mode. Now the night mode itself does actually do a pretty decent job of drawing some extra light within the image and therefore showing some extra detail, something that you certainly might want to utilize. However, it's worth considering that night mode takes a little of an extra few seconds to process, so you'll have to keep your hands steady when you're taking such shots. Now as for the selfie camera, you have got a 20 megapixel f2.2 and it's decent and has got also beauty options. The HDR capabilities also do work a treat and had no problems whatsoever again when it came to my overall skin tone. Furthermore, it is worth pointing out over here that when it comes to low light photography, it is yet again problematic like what you'd find with the rear lenses. There's a bit of noise and it doesn't exactly look as you might expect. Now what about when it comes to video recording capabilities? Well, at the rear you can shoot 4K at 24 or 30 FPS and at 1080p at 30, 60 and 120 FPS. You also got 720p as well. Now the 120 FPS option is only available in the slow-mo mode. Now it is actually pretty decent, specifically at 4K, although the overall stabilization while walking, for example while going downstairs or for example running, is actually pretty poor. There's actually quite a lot of stitching work that is being done and the camera is struggling to keep up. So therefore, if you're just going to be shooting video with this smartphone, you might want to keep it steady and therefore not run or walk around constantly. Now the same could be said about the front shooter. Here you are only going to be limited to 1080p at 30 or 60 FPS, which is actually quite disappointing in this modern era. And over here, yet again, when it comes to handling the capabilities of going around stairs or, for example, running, well, it's not the best. So yet again, you want to stay steady if you're on a video call and therefore conversing with the person that's on the other side of the phone. Now, some of my complaints that I've got about the Redmi 14 Pro 5G are also linked with the 4nm chipset, more specifically the MediaTek Dimensity 7300 Ultra, which has an octa-core processor and a Mali G615 MC2 GPU. Now, across the benchmarks that I threw at it, it performed as you might expect, although in my opinion was just a little bit subpar. In Geekbench 6, for example, I had a single core performance of 1030, while multi-core sat at 2958. As for GFX Bench, it ranged from 6 to 81 FPS, therefore meaning that this smartphone will be perfectly fine for playing more light games, or those, for example, that don't exactly require the utmost GPU performance. But for those hardcore gamers out there that like playing quite intensive games, I think you might be left a little bit disappointed. In this respect, you might want to invest a little bit more money or look for a gaming-centric phone instead. Now this does also lead me on to using the actual software. And here you have got HyperOS, which is Xiaomi's own operating system, which is built upon Android 14. And here you are promised 3 major Android updates. Now the HyperOS itself is actually pretty nice. It's got a very sleek feel to it, but it has got a little bit of bloatware. Furthermore, when linking it with the CPU performance, it can feel a little bit sluggish. For example, when you are dropping down the notification bar or if you're switching between certain apps. Not something you'd come to expect in a mid-range smartphone, but rather something that's more of a budget smartphone. Nonetheless, over here, it is good to see that you have got certain features such as Google Gemini AI integration, which is done by long pressing the power button, and you've even got the circle to search feature. Furthermore, you have also got NFC, which is very much useful for contactless payments, an IR blaster, and an X-axis linear motor for haptics, which is decent but does actually feel a little bit one-directional in comparison to more premium offerings. Now finally we get on to battery life, and here you've got a 5110 mAh battery, and in my controlled benchmark it scored a whopping 25 hours and 16 minutes, which is actually pretty impressive. I had no problems when it came to using this phone on a day-to-day basis, and I was left with plenty of juice in the bank. Of course, it really depends as to what sort of apps you're using and the screen time that you have, but in my case, it was actually perfectly usable. Now, it's worth mentioning over here that the phone has got 45 watts of charging and takes roughly 1 hour to fully charge, which doesn't bother me in the slightest. However, some specs warriors out there will actually be complaining because the previous generation model had 67 watts of charging capacity. Again, it's not something to overly concern about because truthfully it's not going to take you all that faster when it comes to actually charging the smartphone. Plus, a lot of people who are actually going to be charging their smartphone will probably be plugging it overnight. And given the overall battery life of the phone itself, well, given it does a really good job, at least in my controlled benchmarks, and also while using it on a day-to-day basis, well, I've got no real complaints, at least in this department. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Redmi Note 14 Pro 5G. And quite honestly, I do like what the manufacturers achieved with it at this price point. You've got a really nice design, a pretty impressive camera performance, at least in normal lighting conditions, and also a really impressive display, which goes up to 120Hz. However, there's certain considerations that you might want to have, specifically when comparing and contrasting it with some of its key competitors. And here it comes to low light photography performance, CPU and GPU performance, and some of the other things that I've highlighted throughout this review, for example, the software optimizations, which I do think can be done over the air and gives the phone actual room for improvement over time. But nonetheless, I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over some rival alternatives. If you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.